This is Forbidden Speech, the raw truth, with your host, Christina Rivera. In this savvy broadcasting series, we delve into hot topics affecting us all. With cancel culture and big tech censoring any opposing ideas and thoughts outside of mainstream ideology, it has become more important than ever that we tell the raw truth about everything from U.S. world politics, COVID, Christianity, and everything in between. We invite all points of view to come and share their perspective honestly and respectfully. Hi, Professor Hardaway. Welcome back to Savvy Broadcasting, Forbidden Speech, the Raw Truth. I'm so grateful to have you back. We're going to talk about a touchy subject that's been really touchy this past year, and that is what happened on January 6th. It was the certification of this past election, and there are a good many people who were upset about what transpired and felt maybe the election wasn't up and up on their side, and they felt like, oh, I'm going to go out there and this is the day we're going to make it happen. But you're going to share with our audience that legally January 6th is not a day where we kind of do anything different with the election or fix it. It's actually a done deal at that point. And really, you're going to talk more to that, but we're going to talk about if someone or people are not happy with results, there is a process for that, and how would they go about that? So I'll give you the floor.
All right. Well, the fact that it is a minor footnote in terms of the process of electing a president, I think can be confirmed if you would ask your readers or watchers if they've ever even heard of a date of January 6th. I don't think it's on anybody's radar. And the fact that it was made by the media into a kind of a media event, I think says a lot about the importance of it. In fact, it has almost no importance. Let me do a little bit of history here as to why it is even a date at all on the radar of our system, presidential election system. Goes back to the year 1876. Now, in 1876, the election was somewhat of a disaster because it was in the post-Civil War period. And many of the southern states were trying to get rid of the troops in the South, and they were starting to discriminate against, well, not to start discriminating, but really using their newfound power as members of the Union, the southern states controlled by Democrats. The elections in their states in the 1876 election were horrible. The blacks were prevented from going to the polls. There was widespread violence keeping blacks from the polls. And so the New York Times and some other newspapers looked at this and said, this election, there's some real questions about it. And so what they did was they said that if all of the electoral votes in the South were cast for the Democratic candidate, then the election would be won by a Democrat, but it would be, in their view, invalid because of all the violence against African Americans in those states. And so what happened was the only way to resolve it in the end was to have a commission. So the 1876 election actually was, the president was determined not by any kind of counting of ballots or electoral votes in Congress. It was passed by a commission that was supposedly bipartisan, but really wasn't. And they elected the Republican candidate because of all the violence that had occurred. And in the aftermath of that election, the Congress said, we got to prevent this from happening ever again. And so they passed a statute, which is still really in effect, which laid out what we've been using over the past 150 years. It is this, that each state, ever since 1876, each state can decide how to allocate electors. Well, let me go back even a little further back to the Constitutional Convention. The Constitution says very little about how a president is elected, other than it will be determined by electoral votes, and that every state can determine how they're going to cast their electoral votes and the method upon which they're going to determine how they're cast. So each state has the absolute authority under the Constitution to determine how electoral votes are determined. And every state since 1876 has decided to leave it to the people of their state. Before that, some states allowed the legislators to choose the electors. And the whole system of the Electoral College is based on the grand compromise that created the United States of America. Because at the time of the Constitutional Convention, even George Washington, who felt dragooned into even appearing at the Constitutional Convention, because he said it was hopeless, because the small states are never going to agree to a Congress that is based purely on population, because that means the small states would be marginalized. And the big states said, no, it should be based on population, because we want Pennsylvania, New York, and Virginia, and the big states to rule the roost. So there couldn't be a compromise, and the Constitutional Convention was on the verge of not happening. The Constitutional Convention was on the verge of breakdown, and it was Benjamin Franklin who, at the last minute, came up with a dramatic opportunity for a compromise. He said, let's do both. Let's have a Congress that is based not only on population, that'll be the House of Representatives, but also every state equal, because that's what all the small states were insisting upon. And that was the grand compromise that created the United States of America. The second prong of that compromise was that the electoral votes allocated to each state would be based on the equal representation in the Senate. Every state gets 2 electoral votes based on their Senate, the number of senators they have, which does not exactly jive with population. But if this compromise had not been reached, we wouldn't have the United States of America. We'd be very much like South America, because at the time, New York and Pennsylvania were going to form their own country. The small states were going to form their own country. We'd be very much like South America. All right, so each state under the Constitution gets 2 electoral votes for the number of senators. Every state gets at least 2, regardless of population, and they get 1 representative based on depending on how much population they have. So but each state is allowed to determine how they're going to allocate their electoral votes. And since 1876, every state says we're going to leave it up to the people in our state. The statute that was passed in the aftermath of the 1876 election basically laid out the process, which is that the governors of each state will certify what the election of the electors by the people in the state. They will certify that, and they will send that certification to Congress. Now, it would have been much wiser in retrospect if that had been the final determination. Once the governors certify the election, that is it. All right. But Congress couldn't resist in the statute saying, well, we'd still like to go through the ministerial task of counting up your votes. Now, in those days, they didn't have calculators, but you had to do a little bit of arithmetic. And that's what the Congress was expected to do. They would count out 3 electoral votes, say, from Wyoming, and 7 electoral votes, say, from another state, and they would make the calculation. And then they'd say, oh, we counted it up, and guess who got the most electoral votes? Okay, so it was very simple. But Congress then added a clause, which is the source of all this problem that arose on January 6th. And what that clause says, that Congress, in counting the votes, must determine whether or not the votes were certified by the governor of each state in accordance with their own state laws. And so they use this unfortunate phrase that Congress can determine whether the votes have been regularly given. But that clause was always understood until the media got into the act, on January 6th of the year before last. It was always considered to be regularly given, meaning given in accordance with each state's laws. And each state says that we're going to allow the people of our state to elect, to determine the electors. But now Congress, but some people have said, well, maybe the phrase regularly given doesn't mean that it was regularly given according to the laws of each state. Maybe it means that Congress can second guess the states as to whether they have done their job properly. That's not what it was ever meant to be. It was meant to be a ministerial task of tabulation.
Okay.
And
So can I, just to clarify for myself, so understanding it, once the governors certify, it goes to Congress. Basically, they're just doing a counter of
yes,
every single state.
they
Boom.
didn't have
Here,
calculators there, but they,
yeah,
but
we
they,
count these
but-
puppies up, and at the end, okay, based on all the counting, here's the president, and that's it. But now it was said, okay, they're going to determine what the state meant, but they didn't do that on January 6th. They just counted up the votes, didn't they?
what they said was they looked at that phrase in the statute that was passed in the aftermath of the 1876 election, which said that Congress can determine whether the votes were, quote, this is the problem phrase, regularly given. And it has always been understood as meaning that if Congress thinks that a state did not certify their electoral votes in accordance with that state's laws, that they didn't have to, supposedly, they didn't have to accept it. Now, it was only when one person in the Senate or the House said, oh, I don't think this state were in compliance with their own state laws. And so therefore, they could cause the whole Congress to have to vote on this. But that's never happened.
Wow.
At most, you've had maybe one or two say, oh, they weren't regularly given, because some congressperson says, well, I think there was fraud in this particular election. Well, that's not Congress's authority. They have no authority under the Constitution to determine that. Each state is given the power under Article 2 to determine the manner in which they appoint their electors.
Okay.
And the only question Congress has to ask is, did the state follow its own laws?
Now, from the people of a particular state, they've hired these representatives. They work on behalf of us, and they're our voice, the people's voice. So if the representative for the state of Philadelphia or Pennsylvania feel it's not accurate, what is the next steps for that state to do, the representatives to decide, okay, I'm not really happy with the results? What do they do? What is, by law, what are they supposed to do? Or
the way that the statute in question was drafted, that is up to the governor to determine of each state.
Okay.
They certify it. Once they certify it, that is it. Boom. The only thing left for Congress, because they're not even supposed to get their mitts into this election at all. Under the Constitution, there's nothing that says that Congress can approve the votes of the electoral votes. It's the states determine that. And the only job of Congress is to count them up, which they could do. They could just do by, if you have a calculator, you can count up 3 plus 7 plus 13 plus 22. It's an easy task.
Yeah.
But they've lobbed, and on January 6th, there were some people who claimed, well, maybe that clause doesn't refer to that the electoral votes were certified in accordance with the state of the laws of each state. Maybe it means that we have the opportunity to second guess the governors as to whether it followed its own laws.
That makes it messy for sure.
And they said, we have a chance, we don't have to tabulate them if they weren't regularly given. Well, to determine whether a vote is regularly, if you interpret that to say Congress can second guess each of the 50 elections in each state and demand recounts and so forth and so on, saying there's the fraud, it would take years. And that's why certainty is so important. And I hope that any further legislation that comes from Congress will clarify what that term regularly given means. It does not mean that that each state was free of fraud or anything like that. Only that whether or not the governors certified, and that's it. People can go to bed that night saying we've got a new president.
It's done. And normally in the past, it's always been by 11 or midnight. Boom, here's the result, and we go forward. And we've been spoiled. We don't even worry about the Electoral College meeting in December. We don't even worry about that. We never have worried about that. It's usually a done deal by that. Now,
usually a footnote on the back page.
Exactly.
Oh, by the way, the electors met. And the Electoral College, and the votes have been tabulated, and so is president. And by most people think, well, didn't we elect a president on the first Tuesday in November?
Yeah, exactly. Now, if the rare chance where a state governor says, okay, I'm not happy with the way things went about, and he wanted to challenge before certification, what would be his process or her
Well, if
process?
they don't certify by the date that it has to be certified in the statute, then it doesn't count. Their electoral votes won't be in the mix.
Boom. So they're just not, they don't count in the whole, okay.
That's why the governors are certain to certify.
Yeah.
That has to be the certainty. Certainty is more important. Nothing is more destructive to democracy than to have disputes as to who won the election. In the 1960 election, the votes in each state were so the total votes were very close to each other. There was a 1/100% difference. And the media over the years has created this illusion that there's some kind of popular vote. There is no popular vote. People now do not vote for a presidential candidate. They do it like in England. We vote for electors. In England, they call them members of parliament. The members of parliament then go into the parliament and they choose the leader. That's the way we do it here as well. The only reason that we have a separate electoral college, separate from Congress, is because the drafters of the Constitution wanted separation of powers. They did not want us to be like England, where the president, the executive branch, was beholden to the legislative branch, that on moment's notice, they could simply fire the leader and say, we vote of no confidence. We didn't want that. We wanted separation of powers. That's where we have a separate. The Electoral College is a foundation stone of the balance of power. The fact that we have three independent branches of government, so that no branch has overweening power of the other. Legislators pass legislation. They do not elect the president. In countries like UK, the legislators elect the president. And so you don't vote for a presidential candidate. Look, next time you go in the voting booth, in big print it'll say you're voting for Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. And so you think that you're voting for, you're not. You're doing it just like they do in England. You're voting for electors. A guy named Joe Blow, who says, I promise you under oath that if you vote for me as your elector, I will go to the Electoral College and vote for Hillary Clinton. I promise to do that. But can those oaths be enforced? In half the states, they can't. In many states, just like in England, the electors or the members of parliament in England can vote for whoever they want to. And that's why I've always proposed that they be required. In Colorado, of course, we have a law that says the electors have to vote for the candidate they promised to vote for. But the media has created this illusion. There's some kind of popular vote for a candidate. Nothing's further from the truth. And in 1960, some of the electors in some of the southern states didn't require their electors to promise to vote for anybody. They were unpledged. So how do you count popular votes? There's no way. But if you had to count popular votes, which is some of the people who want to undermine the whole electoral process, undermine federalism, have come up with this scheme that each state will vote for the popular vote, but there is no popular vote. And
and what people forget is the idea of one vote, one person, get rid of this whole thing. We'll just make it all popular. Again,
those people are the same people that want to abolish the U.S. Senate, where legislation is passed every year. Not every 100 years or so, we get a hypothetical popular vote that doesn't exist, that doesn't jive with the electoral vote. And so they're very upset about that when it happens once every 200 years or once every 100 years or so. But they don't get upset. A lot of people say, oh, I wouldn't abolish the Senate, when that's where a state like Wyoming, voters there have a greater, 10 times the impact on legislation as voters in California. And the only solution to that is to abolish the Senate. But the drafters of the Constitution knew that somebody might try to undermine the grand compromise that created the United States. So they put into Article 5 that you can't abolish the Senate, upon which the Electoral College is based, unless every state agrees. And that's not going to happen. Because if it did happen, that would mean California would get, say, 42 senators. Wyoming would be lucky to get 1 senator. Wyoming is not going to agree to that. So it's all hypothetical. It's all hype.
It's all hype. And I love that you're coming out here and basing facts on the table, because there's so much animosity on all sides, and no, I'm right, you're wrong, la la la, and then we just miss the point. It doesn't solve anything. And what's most concerning, as you mentioned, is the confidence in the system. If we lose all confidence, it's over as a country. We cannot lose confidence in the process and the way it's set up, and that it allows us to be represented and for our voice to be heard through our representatives.
And a large reason for that, for that angst that comes along the lines of the last couple of presidential elections, is because the misunderstanding of the word regularly given in the statute. Certainty is more important than anything else. To go through all the alleged fraud and can take years. They said in 1960, Nixon conceded the election, even though there was fraud in Illinois, or alleged fraud, maybe even fraud in Texas. But it would have they said it would have taken at least 2 or 3 years for the court cases to go through. In the meantime, you need a president. You need to have somebody who is responsible and who is considered to be a legitimate winner, even if there has been some fraud somewhere. The solution is not to say, well, we're going to hold the whole election in limbo for 3 years without a leader. That's not the solution. That's what some people want. They say if there's been any fraud, you don't go by the certification of the governors, which should be considered absolutely final. And the January 6th, all they do is count the votes. That's the way it should be. But instead, they think, we'll go through court cases. In 2000, they were doing all these court cases and so forth because they were determining whether the electors in Florida were properly elected. Well, that could have, imagine having to do that in all 50 states, which is what these people who want to abolish the Senate, abolish the Electoral College, they think that would be great. Any future legislation should take out that phrase regularly given, because it's been misinterpreted so badly. When the governors certify the electoral votes, that's it. If you want to complain about fraud or something, then you go through the 3 or 4 year process and make sure that's cleaned up by the next election. But you need certainty, because nothing is more destructive. If you look back in history, the Roman Empire didn't fall so much because of outside invaders. It's because the whole empire was weakened because of these disputes about who was going to be the next emperor. And they would have civil wars on this that would go on constantly, which ultimately destroyed it. We have to have certainty. The only way is to say in a statute, a new statute says the words regularly given only means regularly given in accordance with the governor's certification as to how the electors were chosen in their state. And that's it. If governors don't certify, their votes don't count. I can guarantee you that every governor will certify the election. And if there's any kind of fraud going on, you have 4 years to figure that one out before the next election. In the meantime, you need a president.
Exactly. And everyone, don't forget, we have local, community, and state government, which plays just as big a role, if not bigger, for your everyday life. So don't forget that. Everyone just like, president, the biggest election ever, I'll just go for the president election or the mayor. There's so many, you need to pay attention to all the elections. And I really thank you, Dr. Hardaway, for coming again to share this great information. Hopefully it enlightens people so that we stop fighting amongst each other in the country and work together to realize that we're one country and we want to stay that way, but we need to be knowledgeable and have wisdom about what's really going on.
If I could do one thing before we leave, I've written a book explaining all those out. I've covered in our little 30-minute session, facts and history that some people say, well, I want it more detail. I've written a number of books. I've been spending my whole life on the history and the law that pertains to the Electoral College. And any money I get, I used to buy more of these books to give to legislators who are considering undermining federalism, pursuing this illusion that there's such a thing as a popular vote in this country, when in fact the Constitution doesn't mention anything about popular votes. It says every state can determine the electors. And every state has said, we're going to determine the electors based on the popular vote in our state, not somebody else's state, but in our state. Let me get to the book.
Yeah.
If they happen to You can get this book at Saving the Electoral College. It doesn't really need to be saved because it's not going to happen. You're not going to get every state in the union to agree to abolish the Senate, which would, of course, also
Get rid of their
abolish the
voice.
Electoral College. And if you don't understand that connection, this is the book. Okay. It's called Saving the Electoral College, Why the Hypothetical National Popular Vote Would Undermine Democracy. And you can get that on Amazon.
Awesome. Well, I thank you again, Professor Hardaway, for coming. This has been brilliant. Thank you so much for coming to Forbidden Speech, The Raw Truth. Have a wonderful day.
And if you ever like any follow-up on any of these issues that are relating to this, please give me a call, because so many people don't understand the Electoral College. They don't understand our federal system, and they are misled by the media that says at the bottom of the screen, oh, there's a popular vote for such and such a candidate, all hype and all illusory.
Yeah. And that, you know what I say, more importantly, I had someone on recently that said that would solve a lot of these problems is take your emotion out of it. So many people get riled up about what they're seeing on news or whatever, and they let that rile them up.
They think there's such a thing as a popular vote. That there's still people in this country who think when they go in the voting booth, they're voting for a presidential candidate. They are not.
Yeah.
Electors are not, in half the states, the electors are not even bound to vote for a particular candidate.
Yeah. Yeah. And if people find out what's really, or get knowledgeable on what's really going on, they'll feel more empowered, less emotional and scared about what's going on, and know that, okay, I have a piece in this. And if I don't like what's going on, I can vote for new legislation, like you were talking about, make it more clear. But you can only do that if you're aware, you're knowledgeable, and you can write into your senator, congressman, or whatever properly on what needs to happen, and maybe send a wonderful copy of your book to them, your local.
I do. And it's so important that they understand that the Electoral College and the Senate, which are tied together in this grand compromise that created the United States of America, is what has kept this country together.
Yeah.
There was the Civil War where it was challenged, but in every other instance, that's what's kept this country together, and why we have one nation rather than 10 different nations like they have, say, in South America.
And what's also, I don't think people understand. Some people are like, great, let's just break up. We'll be a million different countries. We'll get, but they have to realize.
How has that worked out for South America?
Not very well. So part of our prosperity has been the fact that we've been one country and a country of prosperity, but we can't do that when we're all little bits and pieces fighting against each other. So again, I thank you, Professor Hardaway.
That's what we're on the verge of. I gave a lecture to the Rhodes Scholars recently, and I said the two important provisions of our Constitution are, number one, the Electoral College, which should give us certainty, and number two, the Interstate Commerce Clause. Why we're such a rich country, because we have a coordinated economy where we can trade between the states.
Yes. Well, I'm going to have to let you go. Okay. It's been wonderful connecting with you, and thank you so much for sharing your great wisdom today. Have a wonderful day, Dr.
Like, subscribe, and share this episode. To listen to more savvy episodes and savvy biz tips, go to www.lifeunscriptedradio.com. To find out about our paid sponsorship opportunities or how to become a guest, email Christina at lifeunscriptedradio.com.